December 1942. High above the Solomon Islands, a 19-year-old waist gunner named Eddie Kowalski braces himself inside the belly of a trembling B-17 bomber. His hands clutch the grips of a Browning 50 cal, the metal rattling like it's alive. Through the glass, a Japanese Zero streaks into view, 10 o'clock high, maybe 300 yards out, cutting across the sky like a silver blade. Eddie reacts the only way a man in that moment can. He centers his sights on the enemy's fuselage and opens fire. A thunderstorm of bullets tears through the air. The tracers form bright orange lines, but every single one sails harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The enemy pilot doesn't even flinch. No evasive roll, no panic. Just a smooth glide through the chaos while Eddie's ammo counter ticks down to nothing. This wasn't a rare mistake. It was the story of nearly every bomber crew in those early years of World War II. American gunners, brave, disciplined, trained to perfection, kept missing. Not sometimes, almost always. Early in 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces began reviewing hours of gun camera footage from bombing runs across Europe and the Pacific. The findings were devastating. Aerial gunners were scoring hit rates of less than 4% against fast-moving, crossing targets. Think about that. For every 100 rounds fired at an enemy fighter sweeping past, 96 found only empty sky. And the math got cruel fast. A dogfight rarely lasted more than 10 seconds. The Browning M2 spat out roughly 13 rounds every second, about 130 shots in a full burst. With a 4% hit rate, only 5 might actually strike the plane. 5 bullets against a machine built to take 50. Fighters like the Japanese Zero or the German FW-190 could soak up hit after hit and still stay in the air. Meanwhile, bombers kept falling. In 1943, the 8th Air Force alone was losing nearly 200 bombers every month, each carrying 10 men. That's close to 2,000 airmen killed, captured, or gone missing every 30 days. It wasn't lack of training. It wasn't fear. These gunners did everything by the book. Steady aim, short bursts, perfect tracking. The flaw wasn't in the men. It was in the laws of motion themselves. Instinct tells you to aim where the target is. Physics demands you aim where it's going to be. And when the enemy is slicing across your view at more than 300 miles per hour, instinct doesn't stand a chance. That was the cruel lesson of air combat in those skies over the Pacific. One that countless young gunners, like Eddie Kowalski, learned too late. Late war fighters pushed speeds that made even small fractions of a second deadly. The German Me-262, for example, could thunder past at roughly 540 miles per hour. At those speeds, the delay between pulling the trigger and a round actually reaching the target became a showstopper. A 50 caliber slug from a Browning M2 might race out of the muzzle at about 2,900 feet per second, blistering compared to most bullets, but not instant. Against a fast crossing airplane, that travel time was everything. Keep the distances realistic. In dogfights, close often meant 200 to 400 yards. A Zero cruising at 300 mph covers about 440 feet every second. On a 300-yard, 900-foot shot, the bullet needs roughly 0.31 seconds to reach the aiming point. 31/100ths of a second feels tiny, until you realize what the enemy plane does in that slice of time. In 0.31 seconds, a fighter moving across your sight line advances another 136 feet, the length of about 11 cars. So the gunner was aiming where the airplane sat now, while his bullets arrived where it had been a third of a second earlier. The rounds sliced through empty air. The plane sailed on. This mismatch has a name: deflection error. Armies and navies had known the concept for years. Lead the target, don't aim at it. But classroom theory and actual combat are two different beasts. The amount of lead required wasn't a subtle tweak. It was a big, almost counterintuitive correction. Picture a fighter crossing at right angles, 300 yards out. To compensate, the gunner had to put his sights 15 to 20 feet ahead of the enemy's nose. That meant deliberately pointing into blank sky and trusting the aircraft to fly into the stream of fire. Our instincts rebel at that idea. Training tried to bridge the gap. Starting in 1942, the Army Air Force's flexible gunnery program in Laredo, Texas, threw everything at the problem. Turret simulators, tow target runs from moving trucks, endless diagrams of lead angles. But the classroom drills rarely survived the jump into real missions. Deflection isn't a single number you can memorize. It's a constantly shifting puzzle. Target speed, angle, range, your own motion, whether the enemy climbs or dives, whether your bomber is turning, all of it changes the required lead. And gunners had to make those judgments in seconds, while flak chewed at the plane, alarms screamed, and oxygen masks fogged at 25,000 feet. On top of the math was the human cost. Men who tried to apply deflection under fire sometimes saw their carefully judged leads fail. The natural reaction after a few failed bursts was to fall back on what felt right. Aim at what you see. That retreat to instinct cost lives, because the solution demanded patience, judgment, and a willingness to aim at empty air in the hope that the future would intersect with your bullets. They'd try to outsmart the sky, aim out in front, fire, and watch orange tracers arc harmlessly through empty air. Then, convinced they'd overshot, they'd pull their sights back a little for the next burst. Over and over, the same pattern repeated. A hopeful forward lead on the first burst, then gradual retreat until the gunner was firing right at, or even slightly behind, the enemy plane. Their eyes betrayed them. What looked wrong felt right, so they corrected in the wrong direction. Gun camera reels from 1943 replay that mistake again and again. The cost was brutal and immediate. In October 1943, missions to Schweinfurt turned catastrophic. Roughly 60 of 291 bombers failed to return, about a 20% loss rate. Planes that came home were often mutilated, crewmen dead or maimed, hydraulic lines torn, engines coughing smoke. In post-mission debriefs, gunners said the same thing with quiet fury. The guns worked, the men did their jobs, but the rounds never connected. Something had to change right away. If it didn't, the bombing offensive risked collapse long before it ever reached Berlin. The odd twist is that the answer had already been written down, nearly 2 decades earlier, and then forgotten. In 1924, an American artillery officer named James Puckle, not the 18th century inventor, produced a technical paper called The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. Puckle wasn't an ivory tower theorist. He'd seen the awkward birth of air combat in World War I and understood that aircraft speeds were about to outstrip human instinct. Puckle's paper was mercilessly practical. He ran the numbers and made it plain. Once planes pushed past roughly 150 mph, the lead angles a gunner needed would outgrow any natural intuition. His charts were exhaustive. Tables of required lead for different speeds, ranges, and crossing angles. The figures shocked commanders used to thinking in yards and seconds. A 200-yard shot at right angles against a target doing 300 maritimes needed nearly 47 feet of lead. At 400 yards that jumped to 94 feet. Those aren't small tweaks. That's aiming at empty sky and trusting geometry to do the rest. Puckle's grim forecast was worse. Without mechanical help, air gunners would be effectively helpless inside a decade. The Army shelved the report. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the speed of aircraft climbed relentlessly, but gunnery schools clung to World War I habits. Teach sight picture, breath control, trigger discipline, as if aerial combat were still a stationary marksmanship contest. The voices calling for new methods or devices were dismissed as alarmists. So the men in the turrets went into war armed with courage and training that science had already outpaced. They learned, the hard way, that aerial gunnery wasn't just a test of nerves or trigger control. It was a math problem played out at hundreds of miles per hour, and the human eye alone could not solve it. The logic seemed sound at first. Americans were born marksmen. From Daniel Boone to Sergeant York, from frontier hunts to shooting ranges, hitting moving targets was in the blood. Surely, with enough practice, that same skill would carry over to aerial combat. It didn't. When the U.S. entered World War II in late 1941, the Army Air Forces discovered a painful truth. Their gunnery program was decades behind the pace of modern war. Training lasted barely 4 weeks. Each student fired around 1,000 rounds in total, most of it at stationary targets or slow, towed sleeves that cruised predictably at maybe 150 miles an hour. Nothing about that prepared them for a FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at over 400 meters, twisting and rolling as it attacked. Twisting and rolling as it attacked. Graduates left training with wings on their chests and confidence in their hands, until the first real engagement. The moment a Japanese Zero streaked across their sights, everything they'd learned fell apart. By mid-1942, commanders were desperate. Losses were unsustainable, and nobody knew how to fix it. That's when Captain Robert Williams, part of the 8th Air Force's gunnery analysis team, went digging through old technical archives at Wright Field. Buried in a drawer, he found an old paper, The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery, written in 1924 by Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. Williams read it in one sitting. Stunned. Every word felt prophetic. Puckle had warned that as aircraft speeds increased, gunners would lose the ability to lead their targets accurately. Exactly what was happening now. Williams immediately sent a memo to his commanding officer, underlining 2 words 3 times. He knew. Puckle had been right all along. His math hadn't just predicted the problem, it had forecast a tragedy. And now, hundreds of American airmen were dead because his warning had been ignored. The question wasn't whether he was right. Everyone could see that now. The question was, could anything be done about it? Teaching gunners to consciously calculate lead angles in the middle of combat was a fantasy. No human brain could solve geometry while being shot at in a shaking bomber. But maybe there was another way. Not calculation, but instinct. Across the Atlantic, the British had faced the same nightmare 2 years earlier. During the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, RAF Squadron 609, based at Middle Wallop, discovered its Spitfire pilots were missing their marks too. They were brave men flying superb machines, but their hit rate against crossing German fighters was a miserable 6%. 6 hits out of every 100 bullets. Each Spitfire carried ammunition for only 16 seconds of sustained fire. And yet pilots were emptying their guns while Messerschmitts kept flying home untouched. That's when squadron leader Horace "Horry" Darley made a bold move. He grounded his entire unit for 3 days, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every available plane was needed in the air. Darley wasn't acting out of recklessness. Before the war, he'd been a competitive clay pigeon shooter, and he understood something that the textbooks missed entirely. Great shooters didn't calculate lead. They felt it. They felt the shot. That was the secret. Clay shooters didn't crunch numbers or measure distances. Their minds read the motion of the target automatically, hands swinging the barrel just ahead of the clay without a single conscious calculation. Squadron leader Horace Darley began to wonder if fighter pilots could be taught that same instinct. His test was simple and nearly reckless. At a makeshift range, a Hurricane towed a long canvas banner across the sky, while Darley's Spitfire pilots took turns making live firing passes. But this time, he ordered them to ignore everything they'd been taught. "Don't aim," he said. "Don't calculate. Just feel the movement." Instead of lining up perfect sight pictures, They were told to keep their eyes on the banner, let the aircraft's motion carry the guns through the target's path, and fire while still turning, before the sights ever fully settled. The goal was to let the natural swing of the fighter provide the deflection, not to consciously manufacture it. The first runs were disasters. Tracers streaked through empty air, bullets whipping 50 feet wide of the target. Pilots cursed over the radio, insisting the method was madness. But Darley held his ground. They tried again and again, 40 practice passes each, over 3 relentless days. No math lessons, no charts. No talk of lead angles, just raw repetition, and one rule: fire in motion, not after. By the third day, the results shifted, slowly at first, then unmistakably. Hit rates climbed from 6% to around 12%. It didn't sound revolutionary on paper, but in battle, that meant twice as many enemy fighters hit, twice as many kills, and twice as many Luftwaffe planes limping home too damaged to fight again. Darley filed his report on August 18, 1940, and included an observation that would change air combat theory. The pilots who improved fastest weren't the sharpshooters from peacetime competitions. They were the ones willing to let go of precision. The ones who trusted their peripheral vision and muscle memory instead of trying to aim like riflemen. Darley wrote that the conscious brain was simply too slow for modern air combat. Success required training the subconscious to do the math instinctively. The same way a baseball player tracks a fly ball without ever thinking about angles or gravity. Fighter Command circulated his report, but adoption was uneven. Some squadrons embraced it and saw immediate results. Others dismissed it as reckless, unscientific, even dangerous. The RAF's own training command resisted the idea entirely. Too radical, too undisciplined, they said. But the proof was in the skies. Units that trained their pilots to shoot with motion-based instinct, not precision-based logic, started to win more often. Through the autumn of 1940, those squadrons recorded higher kill ratios and fewer losses. Evidence that sometimes feeling the shot was more powerful than aiming. By early 1941, the motion-based shooting trick was spreading quietly through the squadrons, practiced more than written down, and American observers in Britain took careful notes. But there was a hard limit. What worked for a fighter pilot simply couldn't be copied by a waist or ball turret gunner. A Spitfire pilot could swing his whole airplane to create the needed lead. A B-17 gunner sat strapped into a fixed position as his bomber held steady into flak. He couldn't use the plane's motion to feel the shot. If human reflexes and conscious sums both failed, the fix would have to be a machine. Enter MIT, specifically the Hush Hush Division 7 of the Radiation Laboratory, a name chosen to deflect attention while engineers quietly built fire control gear. Running the show was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer who'd already been working with gyros and flight instruments. Draper saw the problem clearly. This wasn't a problem of marksmanship. It was a problem of prediction. A gunner needed to be shown where the target would be when his bullets arrived, not where it sat now. By July 1943, Draper's team had a prototype, the Mark 14 computing gun sight. It looked like something from a pulpy future. A reflector sight bolted to a gyroscopic computing package weighing roughly 28 pounds, powered by the plane's electrical system. The gunner used a simple mechanical routine to feed it data. He rotated a dial to match a pair of reference marks to the target's wingspan, giving the device an estimate of range. Then he kept the target centered in a small tracking circle for about 2 seconds, while the sight measured how quickly the target was crossing his view. Here's the clever bit. Inside the unit, no electronic microchip did the thinking. Instead, a compact analog brain of cams, gears, and linkages continuously solved the deflection math. Range input, angular velocity from the gyro, and the known ballistics of the .50 caliber round were combined mechanically to compute how far ahead of the enemy the guns should point. The result was projected as a bright reticle that seemed to hover in space in front of the target. Suddenly, the gunner's job changed. He no longer tried to hit the airplane itself. He simply held the aircraft's image inside the sight and placed the gun on the glowing dot. The machine did the invisible geometry. What had been an impossible leap of intuition became a straightforward task of tracking. And for the first time, the physics that used to betray a gunner's instincts were turned to his advantage. If the gunner had ranged correctly and kept the target steady in the sight, that glowing dot did something miraculous. It told him precisely where to fire. The Mark 14 did in an instant what would take a person with pencil and paper far too long. It solved the deflection math 30 times a second, constantly recalculating as range and angle shifted. Field trials at Naval Air Station Norfolk in August 1943 felt like cheating. Men who had never managed more than 5% hits on crossing targets suddenly found themselves landing 18% on their very first day with the Mark 14. Give them a week and the rates climbed above 25%. In plain terms, that meant 5 times more enemy planes damaged or destroyed in the same engagements. A game changer. But machines take factories and time. Mass production of the Mark 14 didn't ramp up until early 1944, and new sites were prioritized for fresh aircraft coming off the lines. For most crews, flying through late 1943 and into 1944, the high-tech solution was still out of reach. They needed something immediate, something that worked with the gear already bolted to their ships and planes. The real breakthrough came from the teeth of combat, from gunners who had bled and learned at sea and in the islands. In the Pacific, where visibility was often clearer than the cloud-choked skies over Europe, practical experience mattered. One of those men was Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a waist gunner attached to the USS Lexington's Air Group. By March 1944, Fleming had flown 31 combat missions, survived 4 planes shot down around him, and fired roughly 40,000 rounds in anger. He'd personally seen hits on 7 enemy aircraft, enough hard lessons to fill a notebook. Fleming's notebook wasn't full of theory. It was full of sketches. Enemy planes with hand-drawn lines projecting forward from their noses, annotated with how many aircraft lengths of lead had worked in real fights, 2 lengths, 3 lengths, and so on. On March 14, 1944, he showed that notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, already a naval legend and Medal of Honor winner. O'Hare spotted the value immediately. This was raw, combat-tested deflection data. Not intellectual diagrams, but what actually put rounds into enemy skins. O'Hare ordered Fleming to teach it, not in classrooms, but in hands-on drills. Fleming's training was simple and brutal. Gunners would take their posts while a crewman paraded a model aircraft on a pole across the flight deck. The idea was to replicate the visual cues of a crossing fighter and force gunners to measure lead by eye in plane-length units, then fire short bursts at those empty air points. No gyros, no electric hookups, just disciplined practice, repeated until the subconscious learned to trust those measured leads. What Fleming brought to the table was a replicable, low-tech fix that crews could use instantly. It didn't replace computing sites, but it saved lives in the months before the Mark 14 could be everywhere, turning battlefield experience into a teachable craft. As the mock aircraft on its pole swept past at different angles, Fleming drilled his men relentlessly. 1 plane length for shallow angles, 2 for medium, 3 or more for steep crossing shots. That was it. The entire system distilled into something any exhausted 19-year-old gunner could remember under fire. No trigonometry, no gyroscope, just a visual rule. Count plane lengths forward from the enemy's nose, then fire. The Lexington's gunnery officer, skeptical but out of options, agreed to a proper trial during operations near Truk Lagoon In late March 1944, he pulled the ship's records. Ammo expenditure, WWII, confirmed hits, everything, from the previous 2 months, and then compared the same data after Fleming's training cycle. The results were stunning. Before the program, 4.2 hits per 100 rounds fired at crossing targets. After 6 weeks, 9.1 hits per 100. Their accuracy had more than doubled. Word raced across the Pacific Fleet. By May 1944, modified versions of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught aboard the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each carrier's gunnery officers tweaked the system, but the principle remained the same. Give the human eye a simple, consistent measuring stick tied to what it could actually perceive. Gunners didn't need to think about milliseconds of bullet flight or 50-foot distances at 300 yards, numbers that meant nothing in the chaos of battle. Instead, they just needed to picture 2 plane lengths ahead, or 1 wingspan forward. The enemy aircraft itself became the ruler. The zero they were tracking provided its own scale. All the gunner had to do was project that shape forward into empty air and trust his instinct to fire. The U.S. Army Air Forces took notice. By mid-1944, they had standardized their own variant, called radius of action shooting. Technical manuals were rewritten to include diagrams showing the correct leads expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. At Lavenham Gunnery School in England, instructors tore up the old marksmanship courses and rebuilt them entirely around this visual reference method. And it worked. Mission loss rates, though still heavy, began to fall. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing 5.2% of its bombers on every mission. By July 1944, that figure had dropped to 3.4%. That difference, fewer empty bunks, fewer telegrams home, represented hundreds of airmen who made it back across the Channel alive. But the story didn't end there. Even with Fleming's method in hand, another obstacle emerged. One buried deep inside the human brain itself. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces began noticing a strange, consistent pattern in post-mission interviews. The gunners knew the technique. They could recite the rules cold. Yet in combat, when tracers lit the sky and the enemy flashed past in seconds, their instincts betrayed them. Their hands still twitched back toward the target center. Their eyes still wanted to chase what they could see, not where it would be. The battle between training and instinct had only just begun. The tragedy, Captain Harold Clean realized, wasn't ignorance, it was biology. Every gunner knew the correct lead distances. They could quote them word for word during classroom reviews or post-mission debriefings. But when death came roaring in at 400 miles per hour, all that knowledge vanished behind instinct. The brain's primal survival circuit, the one that had kept humans alive for 100,000 years, took control. It screamed, "Aim at the threat!" Clean began studying the phenomenon using gun camera footage paired with pilot interviews, meticulously charting where gunners aimed as the fight progressed. He found a consistent, terrifying pattern he called threat fixation collapse. At the start of an engagement, gunners often began correctly, leading their targets by 2 or 3 plane lengths. But as the enemy closed the distance and the tracers flashed back at them, their aim point drifted. First slightly behind the nose, then on the fuselage, then behind the tail. By the final second before impact, many were literally shooting at empty sky where the enemy had already been. The collapse was fastest in head-on attacks, where closing speeds could exceed 500 miles per hour. At that rate, a gunner might have 2 seconds. 2! From the moment the enemy appeared to the moment cannon shells started raking across his bomber. Under that stress, rational thought ceased to exist. The only way to fix it, Clean concluded, was not through lectures or diagrams, but through conditioning. The technique had to sink beneath conscious awareness, down to the same reflexive level as walking or catching a baseball. But that kind of instinctive training demanded something the U.S. military hadn't had in 1942 or 1943 time. WWII. Late 1944, as Allied air superiority increased and training infrastructure expanded, that began to change. The 4-week gunnery courses of the early war were replaced by 8- and 10-week programs. Trainees now fired 5,000 rounds instead of 1,000, more than triple the ammunition, and over half of those rounds went toward fast-moving, unpredictable targets. The Naval Air Gunners School at Jacksonville, Florida, pioneered a breakthrough drill that summer. Engineers mounted 50 caliber Brownings on motorized turrets capable of rapid rotation and elevation, then had high-speed boats tow canvas targets across open water at up to 60 miles, varying their distance and crossing angle randomly. Students trained in brutal repetition, 50 to 70 firing passes a day. No verbal corrections, no lectures, just shoot, check, adjust, repeat. The instructors understood what Kleene had proven. The subconscious learns faster through feedback than the conscious mind learns through instruction. The results showed in combat. Film analysis of elite gunners, men who had survived 30 or more missions, revealed something extraordinary. Even under heavy attack, their deflection points did not collapse. When an FW-190 came slicing through a formation, cannons blazing, their hands stayed steady. Their tracers still walked across the sky, ahead of the enemy, never chasing behind. Many of these veterans later admitted they had been convinced they were about to die in those moments, that their fear was total. Yet their hands moved correctly anyway. They had reached a state the Japanese martial artists called mushin. No mind. Technique without thought. Instinct without hesitation. Instinct without hesitation. It was the highest possible level of mastery, and one that most gunners, tragically, never lived long enough to achieve. The arithmetic of war is cruel. If true mastery of deflection shooting demanded roughly 10 weeks of training and $5,000 live rounds, but the bomber campaign needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, something had to give. Most crews never reached that automatic, no-thought level. They stayed trapped in the stage where they could do the right thing if they had time to think. But once panic, surprise, or extreme stress arrived, their technique frayed. That uneven skill set created a weird, deadly hierarchy inside every formation. Defensive fire wasn't a steady wall. It was a patchwork determined by who happened to be manning each turret. A group with several hardened veterans could turn back an attack that would shred a formation made up of green crews. German pilots learned this quickly. They watched for faltering or thinly intense flak and attacked the weak spots, steering clear of boxes where the tracers were heavy, immediate, and well-led. In short, success became as much about where the right gunners sat as about the number of aircraft in the sky. What began as improvisation and hard-won tricks didn't disappear with VE Day. The central lesson, you must aim where the target will be, not where it is, simply migrated into every later weapon system. Draper's mechanical computing. Sights were the first major step. Machines that solved complex prediction problems in real time. Those analog brains matured into successive generations of sights and fire control systems that served through Korea, and evolved again into faster, more compact digital computers. By the Vietnam era, fighters carried radar and computer-assisted gun sights that did in microseconds what earlier gyros took a fraction of a second to calculate. Ultimately, guns themselves receded in importance. Long-range guided missiles now perform the same prediction role at vastly larger scales. They sense, compute, and adjust their paths toward where a target will be, not where it sits when the weapon is launched. Modern radars don't just follow an enemy's current track. They model future motion from speed and acceleration, then cue weapons and pilots to intercept accordingly. The physics never changed. We simply built faster, smarter ways to answer it. So the story of aerial gunnery is two stories at once, one human and one mechanical. On the human side, it's about training, repetition, and the tragic limits of instinct under fire. On the mechanical side, it's about machines that took an impossible task off the shoulder of a frightened young gunner and let math, gears, and later electronics do the terrible predicting instead. Between those two forces, men and machines, air combat was remade. The challenge William Fleming wrestled with using pencil sketches back in 1944 is now handled effortlessly by machines crunching trillions of calculations per second. What once demanded instinct and experience from human gunners has become the domain of computers and radar. Yet, the essence of deflection shooting, the art of aiming where the target will be, not where it is, still lives on in modern pilot training. Even today, at the Navy's Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, young aviators still learn old-fashioned guns-only dogfighting. Not because they expect to duel with cannons in real combat, but because these lessons sharpen something far deeper: spatial awareness. Pilots who master deflection shooting learn to feel motion, to read angles, anticipate closure rates, and sense when to lead a moving target. Those instincts serve them not just in a gunfight, but in every split-second decision they make in the sky. And the concept has spread far beyond the cockpit. Modern air defense systems, from the Phalanx CIWS that guards naval ships to the CRAM units defending bases on land, are essentially mechanical successors of those World War II gunners. The Phalanx fires an astonishing 75 rounds a second, guided by radar that continuously recalculates where the incoming missile will be next. It's the same math Eddie Kowalski had to do by instinct over the Pacific, just millions of times faster, and without human hesitation. Even video games echo those same principles. In simulators like War Thunder or Digital Combat Simulator, players quickly discover that firing straight at a moving aircraft never works. They must learn to anticipate, to lead their shots, just as the bomber crews once did. And when they finally get it right, when their rounds connect almost by reflex, they've reached the same level of unconscious mastery the best wartime gunners once achieved. That leap from barely 4% hit accuracy in early 1943 to more than 20% by the end of 1944 wasn't the result of better guns or bigger numbers. It came from a deeper understanding of how humans think, see, and react under pressure. It was a triumph of cognition over chaos, and it saved thousands of airmen's lives, changed the course of air warfare, and proved that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a machine, but the human mind learning to work in harmony with it. All of it began with a simple realization that instinct, no matter how deeply rooted, can sometimes lead us astray. Survival depended on teaching ordinary people to fight against what felt right, and instead trust what the laws of motion demanded. Those gunners who learned to shoot into open sky, believing that their bullets would find an enemy they couldn't yet see, proved something extraordinary about the human mind. They showed that instinct isn't destiny, that with enough knowledge, discipline, and sheer will, we can retrain ourselves to see the world as it truly works, not just as it appears. That hard-won truth, forged in fire over Europe and the Pacific, still matters today. Because whether in combat, science, or daily life, the challenge is often the same: to silence the voice of instinct and trust the quiet logic of reality, even when every part of us wants to do the opposite.